right is still right, even if you stand by yourself.
Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court.
Welcome to this week's post-election edition of Case in Point, the legal show for regular people. I am Sarah Parshall-Perry. I'm a senior legal fellow here at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and I'm really excited because today there is lots of buzz around the results of Tuesday. I'm going to be talking to Hans Von Spakovsky, who is also a senior legal fellow here and the manager of our election reform project, and boy, has it had a year. In fact, since the beginning of the year, more than 200 election-related cases, both in federal and state court, have been filed. And sure enough, we saw what could have been the biggest outcome in the modern century of voting. We saw Donald Trump take the White House in a landslide. As of today, and we're recording this on Wednesday, he has 292 Electoral College votes to secure the presidency. And we are still waiting on the calling of whether or not the House of Representatives will go to Republicans or Democrats. Obviously, the Senate has obviously been taken by the GOP at this point, and there are a few races left in the House still to trickle in, but it is looking very good for, I believe, the Party of Reason. We've got lots to talk about today. We're going to talk with Hans about his experience in the Federal Election Commission. We're going to talk a little bit about what we saw at the Supreme Court and the determinations that they made on election-related cases coming out of 4 different states across the country. We're going to talk about the election integrity project that we run here at the Heritage Foundation and why election integrity is something about which Hans is incredibly passionate. So thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Case in Point. I'm here with Hans Von Spakovsky, who's a colleague of mine in the Mies Legal Center and the director of our election reform project. The man has got a CV as long as my arm, but we're kind of dealing with a little bit of election hangover today, right? So we're recording this on Wednesday after many of us had a very, very late night doing election-related media coverage and watching the polls come in. So I'm just going to start from the top. First of all, did you find the outcome here, which is, I think, nothing short of a landslide for incoming president and former President Donald Trump? Did you find that to be surprising or very likely?
No, I thought it was very likely. When you saw polling showing that the 2 biggest issues for voters were the economy, which has been doing so poorly, and illegal immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, look, you had one side, Donald Trump, talking about how he was going to try to remedy those problems, and you had Kamala Harris refusing to answer on that. And combine that with the fact that I think I saw polls showing that 70% of Americans thought the country's in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
When you have polling like that, any incumbent president or vice president is going to have a problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, you can't, for somebody particularly who was a business mogul, the economy, I think, was always going to be a strong platform point for him, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and we're dealing with, listen, the average American is now assuming more than $11,000 in extra cost simply for necessities. That's like gas and groceries, right? So I felt that. I know personally in my pocketbook that was always going to be a winning issue. I am surprised. I was watching some news coverage today that he actually also had the Hispanic vote by a margin of 10 points, which indicates that the individuals who come to this country legally, who go through the appropriate process to naturalize, who are running businesses and sending their kids to school and paying taxes are going, wait a minute, why is the government giving free handouts to individuals who are crossing over illegally when we did it the right way? And it's really sort of a slap in the face. But that was a number that I think really surprised me.
See, I do a lot in immigration, besides elections. And actually, I'm not surprised by that because whenever I've given talks on immigration issues, particularly illegal immigration, the people who come up to me afterwards who are the angriest at all the pushes to provide amnesty, work permits, things like that for people who come here illegally are legal immigrants.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember this, but the left is constantly making the mistake of, for example, thinking that Hispanic Americans agree with them on issues like that. Recall years ago when California put up a referendum to stop doing dual language instruction, Spanish and English in schools, which they had put in, and the referendum said, no, all kids have to be taught English.
Yeah.
Hispanics overwhelmingly voted for that in California. That's why it was approved, because their whole point was, if we've immigrated this country, we want our kids to get assimilated, and that means learning the common language of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And the young vote, actually, by a 10-point margin or thereabouts, also went to Donald Trump, which is another statistic that just blew me away. But I think what we're seeing, and this is heartening, because I have an 18-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 15-year-old.
Right.
So if the younger generation, right, Generation Z, is identifying the fact that these are common sense propositions, right? Keep the border secure, keep our national defense strong, make the economy robust, help us get jobs, don't tax our tips. These are such common sense propositions. I almost feel that the current administration, the Biden-Harris administration, almost swung the pendulum too far left too quickly. I mean, you and I have talked about this. Some of the executive orders coming out of the White House the day after Biden's swearing in were some of the most extreme initiatives that we've seen in modern American governance. But I'm hopeful, looking at these young people, that they're recognizing that no, Generation X and, the boomers are not idiots. These are propositions that have worked in the past, and this was a president, I think, who accurately tapped into that.
No, I think he did, and that's particularly true. Look, a lot of young people are getting out of school with enormous debts, and what are they? They're in their first jobs.
Yeah.
And what were they faced with? A poor economy, poor job prospects. Grocery prices that have gone up, 20%?
Yeah, ridiculous.
They're having to go to the gas station to fill up their cars with really expensive gas. I mean, I don't recall ever paying as high a price as we've paid over the past 4 years to fill up my car. And first-time home buyers, that's these young kids. And that's almost impossible now with the way interest rates and other problems are. So they are actually facing the economic problems which all these celebrity endorsees who were getting up on stage with Kamala Harris don't worry about and don't have any problems with, because they don't worry about food prices going up. They don't worry about rental prices going up. They have limos taking them wherever they are, which I thought that was really a big mistake by the Harris campaign, because while people admire a lot of celebrities, having celebrities actually tell folks there's something wrong with you if you're not voting the way I think you ought to vote.
Right.
I don't think that got them very far, and I think that actually turned people off.
Yeah, and the hubris of somebody like a Taylor Swift preaching about climate change while she's taking her private jet all over the nation. That's there is a certain point at which intellectual dishonesty comes to light, and even for the younger generations who, sometimes I've worried that they are utterly lost to reason, but I'm glad that my son and my daughter are among this cohort of individuals. At a certain point, people are going, well, I don't really care what a celebrity has to say. Right? I don't care what Robert De Niro or Richard Gere or Taylor Swift or Katy Perry have to say. Who among any of those people is qualified to speak on ordinary, average, everyday American issues like the economy, right?
Well, none of them, because they live in this fantasy world fueled by lots and lots of money, and that's not the rest of us. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the litigation surrounding the presidency itself. We saw a couple of what are called emergency docket. People on the left call it the shadow docket. I've also heard rocket docket. But these were not merits determinations. The Supreme Court weighed in simply procedurally on a couple of different cases. So tell me a little bit about those cases.
Well, I'll tell you the most important one. And the most important one was when a month before the election, the Justice Department sued Virginia because Virginia had taken aliens off the voter rolls. Now, it's important for people to understand that these were people who self-identified as aliens.
Yeah.
When they went in to get their driver's license.
Right.
And that, for them to register to vote is a criminal violation of federal law. In fact, it's a felony for an alien to do that. So what does the Justice Department do, which is supposed to enforce that federal law? They don't go to Virginia and say, ooh, send us the files on each of these aliens so we can investigate and potentially prosecute them. No, they go to court and say, Virginia, you can't do this. You can't take these aliens off the rolls. You have to put them back on. And it's also a sign of how, frankly, badly our federal courts have now been stocked with individuals that a Biden-appointed judge said, oh, yeah, DOJ, you're right. And that's because Biden in the last 4 years has appointed probably the most left-wing ideologues we have ever had on the federal bench. Now, fortunately, Virginia ended up appealing that all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court stayed the decision saying you can't make put in an order like this right before the election.
Right.
So it's temporary, but I actually think in the long run, Virginia will win this because there's nothing in federal law that says states have to keep aliens on their voter rolls.
Right, and DOJ had claimed, a violation of the Voter Registration Act, right?
Yeah, what everybody calls motor voter, the National Voter Registration Act.
Right,
yeah,
right.
And I'm sorry, but their interpretation is just not right.
Well, that's not the first wonky interpretation we've seen from the Department of Justice. We could wax poetic about everything we've seen from this Department of Justice and the lawyers within the administration.
But listen, what the difference was between this election and the 2020 election was that, look, the standard tactics of the Democratic Party has been, through their lawyers, is to file all this litigation at the last moment to get rules that have been put in by the state legislature governing the election process to get them waived, to get them voided. And they were pretty successful in getting that done before the 2020 election. This year, the RNC and the Trump campaign were actually prepared for that. They had way staffed up their lawyers. And when situations like that arose in various places, they were in court immediately. Yeah,
that was great.
And that was successful. You may recall in Pennsylvania, which now has gone, as we know, for Donald Trump.
Right.
Look, one of the counties broke state law during the early voting process by telling people who were standing in line at 5 o'clock when the polling place closed, well, you have to go home, you can't vote. Well, look, it's a standard rule in every state that if you're in line at the time the polls close, you get to vote.
Yeah.
And they immediately went to court. They got an order from a judge saying you can't do that. That's violating state law. And the judge ordered extended early voting times to make up for that. But that only happened because, like I said, the Trump campaign and the RNC were ready to go and dropped litigation immediately to get that fixed.
Yeah. And you know what? We're seeing so much lawfare in the election space right now.
Are.
Yeah, I mean, it really is for people who don't follow election law. And you're the preeminent expert, and I want to talk a little bit about your personal experience in the FEC, but I really feel as though this was the year, understanding the incredibly high stakes of this particular election, and not just president, but for the Senate and the House. I think this was something for which the preparation is going to ultimately pay off long term because we've seen more than 200 election-related cases filed since January 1st of this year. So we're not even toward the end of the year yet. No. We're approaching December, but more than 200 cases across the country. And listen, you oversee our election integrity project in the Meese Legal Center, where you and I both work. And all I have to say is you're going to have a lot of work cut out for you, or at least the interns are doing the research.
And you know what's important about those 200 cases you mentioned is that the election we just had hasn't ended those cases. In fact, I foresee a renewed effort by folks on the left side of the political aisle. Look, the whole purpose of all of these lawsuits is to get rid of rules they don't like. Things like voter ID requirements.
Yeah.
Cleaning up voter rolls by taking aliens off. They don't want anything like that.
Yeah.
They're going to keep fighting. In fact, I think they'll have even renewed energy to fight this because they're going to blame actually good reforms for potentially having lost. I don't think that's the case. I think it just prevented the kind of cheating we don't want to see in elections. But Republicans need to not rest on their laurels.
Yes.
They need to understand that all these now post-election lawsuits that are going on, they need to continue to fight to put in good election security measures.
Yeah. Oh, I 100% agree. And I did see a graphic late last night that said Kamala Harris won every state that didn't have a voter ID law in place, which, again, does not surprise me.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
So that's interesting. It sounds like future litigation is not only certain, but it is definitely something for which we're going to see renewed vigor on the left, because these are obviously, and they're guaranteed measures to ensure that every American's voice is counted, right?
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
It's not, the Democrats have turned this into a partisan thing, but it shouldn't be.
Right.
I mean, the whole point of it is to have honest elections. And listen, unfortunately, as you know, we maintain an election fraud database at the Heritage Foundation.
Yep. That's a plug, by the way, because it's getting a little bit of an overhaul. So.
Look, some of these cases that we have in there, these are proven cases of fraud. It's not one party stealing from the other party. It's people within the same party stealing from each other, particularly in primaries. And so if you're an honest Democratic voter, you would want and would support things like requiring an ID to vote.
Yeah. So one of the other cases on the emergency docket that the Supreme Court made a determination on prior to the election went to RFK Jr.'s ability or inability to stay on the ballots in the states of Wisconsin and Michigan.
Right.
Now we've since learned that Wisconsin, shockingly, went for Trump. That was a big surprise for me. So he was not a spoiler in that race. But talk a little bit about that determination. It had to do with the timeline for early voting. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think the Supreme Court didn't want to get into stepping in and changing the deadline set under state law.
Yeah.
And the problem was that with early voting had already started when all the efforts started going on to get RFK off the ballot. Now, I really don't understand why the Wisconsin State Election Commission refused to do that, because even if it's too late to change the ballot, there's an easy solution. This is not very costly. You put a big sign in every early voting site saying, "Notice to voters,
right.
RFK is still on the ballot, but he's withdrawn from the race." And for everybody you've sent an absentee ballot to, fine, send a simple notice, even a postcard, saying, "You were sent an absentee ballot, your request, please be advised.
Yeah.
RFK has withdrawn from the race, so if you vote for him in this ballot, your vote will be wasted."
Yeah.
That could have been done without going through the expense and problems of changing and printing new ballots. And I really can't see any reason for not doing that other than political.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about the Supreme Court, but there's a case in front of the Supreme Court right now out of Louisiana going specifically to the gerrymandering of voting districts. Talk about that case a little.
Yeah, this is a really important case. And the reason is that it's under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 basically says, look, you can't discriminate on the basis of race in the voting context. And the way that's been applied to redistricting cases is the courts have said you can't dilute the votes of black voters and other minority voters, okay? But there's a very careful warning in Section 2 that says that the ban on dilution of the votes of minorities does not entitle them to proportional representation.
Yeah.
In other words, the fact that, for example, the population of a state may be 20% African American does not mean that under the Voting Rights Act they're entitled to 20% of the congressional seats.
Right.
But
that would sound a lot like equity, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But see, that's what happened in this Louisiana redistricting case. The courts basically came in and said, well, for years Louisiana has had one congressional district, I think out of 6, that was what they call a majority-minority district. In that particular district, African Americans, even though they're a minority in the state, they're a majority of the voters. So they can choose whoever they want to get elected. But the courts came in and said, oh, no, Louisiana, because African Americans are a bigger share of your state population, they're entitled to a second seat.
Yeah.
So to me, that clearly violates that warning in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The lower courts, I think, went the wrong way on this decision, and the Supreme Court has decided to accept the case. And I think this is very, very important because there's been this push in recent years to convince judges to just ignore that thing saying it doesn't entitle you to proportional representation.
So they've granted cert. That is, I mean, you're going to have a very busy Supreme Court season, as am I think, because we also know that cases like gender medicine bans are in front of the Supreme Court, and those oral arguments are going to be held a month from now.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about your personal experience at the FEC. You were appointed in 2005 by President Bush. What makes you, first of all, so passionate about election integrity? And second of all, what was it like serving at the FEC?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm passionate about election integrity because I'm a first-generation American. My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. My father was Russian, escaped communism twice, and my childhood was filled with stories from them talking about how lucky we were to live now in this democratic republic and how important it was for citizens to remain vigilant because, as they said and experienced, you can very quickly lose.
Oh yeah,
a democracy or a free country, and election integrity is a key to that. If you don't have fair and honest elections, you can't maintain a republic. The FEC was really interesting. For folks who don't know, that's Federal Election Commission, and they are the ones responsible for enforcing our federal laws on the raising and spending of money in federal elections. So if you're running for Congress, running for president. It was an interesting experience. It's run by 6 commissioners, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And on a lot of the enforcement cases where we're going after somebody for violating the law, we often pretty much agreed. But the whole problem in this area was, and this really told me the difference between the two sides of the political aisle, was that unfortunately this federal law is Byzantine in its complexity. Okay, and there are a lot. It's
a great word. I'm gonna work that in. I don't think that word gets enough play, honestly.
Yeah, there are a lot of provisions that are ambiguous and hard to understand. And the chief fights we would get into between the 6 commissioners was that when language of a statute was ambiguous, so that it was unclear what it was saying you could or couldn't do.
Right.
The Democratic commissioners always said, well, if it's ambiguous, the government wins. Whereas the Republican view was, look, if the law is ambiguous, the public wins.
Yeah.
Because if we, the commissioners, can't agree on what the law requires, well, how can you expect a candidate or a member of the public to understand it? And to me, that apply. I didn't care whether the candidate was a Republican, a Democrat, a Green Party, or an independent.
Yeah.
The law should be absolutely clear so that you will know whether what you're doing is a violation of the law or not. And that was the big difference. The other big difference was the FEC issues regulations, as unfortunately too many government agencies do, applying the law. And the chief difference between the two parties just generally was that the left side of the political aisle always wanted to put in more restrictions, regardless of the First Amendment. And the right side of the political aisle was saying, well, wait a minute, you may not like that behavior, but it's protected by the First Amendment. We shouldn't regulate that.
Right. So I want to talk about an argument we hear every single election cycle. It never fails. Progressive liberal pundits are always talking about abolition of the Electoral College. This is as old as we've had elections. What is your quick and dirty response to why we need the Electoral College? Why not just the popular vote, Hans?
That's actually very easy. If you look at the original Constitutional Convention, what the framers, the Constitution said was they were afraid if you had a national popular vote system, then candidates for president would simply go to the big cities, the big urban areas, and they would ignore the rest of the country, the more rural areas, the less populated. By putting in an electoral college system, the bigger states that are more populated, they get more electoral college votes. But the smallest state in the U.S., no matter how small its population, is still going to get at least 3 electoral college votes. And if they combine their vote with other smaller states, they can win the presidency.
Yeah.
And look, that's even more so true today. And anybody who doubts that, look at the map on any of the big news websites of this election we just had.
Yeah.
The whole, almost all the country in between the East Coast and the West Coast, where the big cities are, and of course Chicago, it's all red.
Yeah.
And if we had a national popular vote system, the 6 biggest cities in the U.S. would get to choose who was president.
Yeah. And that's it. And leave everyone else disenfranchised.
Right. And,
yeah.
And part of that is by forcing a candidate to really have to campaign throughout the country, they thought you'd get actually somebody who was more attractive to a broader section of Americans. Now, I always have people say to me, oh, yeah, well, the only place they go campaign are the swing states. Well, there's some truth to that, but, swing states change.
Yeah, they sure do.
There are states today that are swing states that used to not be. There are former swing states that now have gone to one side or the other. Swing states change. What doesn't change are the big cities. They just get bigger.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about what's still outstanding. Again, we're recording this on Wednesday, but it's going to air on Thursday. It's regular time. We've got Donald Trump with 292 electoral college votes. You need 270 to secure the presidency. Kamala Harris with 224. The Senate obviously has gone to Republicans, but the House still is hanging in the balance. So
right.
Do you have a sense of where that's going to go? Because we're still down to the wire without a clear answer.
Well, as they started with a tiny difference. What was it, 6 votes?
Yeah.
So that means the control really just rolls down to a couple of races around the country.
Yep.
And I'm not sure where it's going to go. But taking control of the Senate is extremely important, actually, for Donald Trump to have a successful presidency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that means that he can actually nominate and get judges confirmed. And let me tell you, we need to fill vacant spots with some sane judges who are actually going to adhere to the Constitution and the rule of law. But it also will help him with the executive branch because he's got to get people confirmed into the leadership positions everywhere, DOD, the Justice Department. And if the Senate were under the control of the opposition party, he wouldn't be able to get his people in there.
That's exactly it. He'd be sort of idling by with empty cabinet positions and not being able to actually accomplish real work.
Yeah, and that's why that's really an important accomplishment. One, winning the presidency, but also getting control of the Senate.
So last question. Obviously, you run our election integrity project here with decades of experience in this arena. So if our listeners and our viewers want to go and find our database and our map, where do they find that?
It's go to heritage.org and just click on the election integrity scorecard. And what that'll do is it'll pull up a map of the U.S. Click on your state and it'll pull up our complete analysis of your state. And you'll quickly be able to see, does my state require an ID to vote? What does my state do to clean up and maintain the accuracy of voter rolls? And you'll also see what it is they should be doing but are not doing. And that gives you the ability to talk to state legislators and say, hey, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? The Heritage Foundation recommends this, and yet we're not doing it.
Yeah. Hans, you are a gentleman and a scholar. You're a great colleague. And my hope for you specifically is that you get some sleep this long weekend.
I'm looking forward to doing that, yes.
That's it for this week's episode of Case in Point, the legal show for regular people. Be sure to follow us on all of the platforms, whether that's X at Case in Point Pod, or share this particular podcast with your friends. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Rumble. I had to use my kids for some of these descriptions. And we'll look forward to talking to you again next week on Case in Point.